Thanks very much, Prue, and good morning to all of you. And being the third speaker, I had this incentive to finish on time so you can get to morning tea after being lectured to for an hour and a half. Could I begin by just saying how pleased I am that the department's been able to partner with a range of other organisations to sponsor this conference. Because placemaking essentially is very much at the heart of what we're trying to do. When the department was established in its current form 3 years ago, the Premier said that the reason planning and community development should come together is they're essentially two sides of the one coin. And that's actually a fairly obvious insight, but it's something that no one had actually said before, and certainly no one had actually given any institutional form to. It was very much new territory for public administration and has arisen because of the recognition about the increasing importance of cities to our prosperity, about the value of strong communities, and the need to develop new models of planning and service delivery that cut across traditional boundaries and disciplines. So placemaking is essentially about using planning and community development together, working with individuals and organisations to create and improve the places in which we live. Fairly simple concept, and as we've heard today from our two previous presenters, it's one that presents us with a whole range of very, very significant challenges. What I want to do today is to do three things really. Firstly, to put placemaking into a broader urban development context, particularly within the framework of urban development policy. Secondly, to give you some sense of some of the examples of what we would call placemaking in the department and within the various agencies of the Victorian Government. And finally, I'd like to finish with some reflections on what one can only call a vibrant debate on urban development policy, which is currently underway in this city. Just to begin with some very broad context, Melbourne, like many cities around the world, but particularly cities in Australia, is facing a range of structural challenges and, by implication, opportunities. The first of which is population growth and how to manage what will be inevitably a city, from Melbourne's perspective, a city moving from 4 million to 5 million to 6 million within the next 2 or 3 decades. What the slide up on the board just indicates to you that we've had a variety of different periods in Melbourne's history of very, very rapid population growth. In fact, in 2008, Melbourne's population increased by 117,000, which was in actual absolute numbers, the largest single increase in any one year in our history, although obviously not the largest in a proportionate sense. So meeting the challenge of a growing city, 4, 5, 6 million, presents us with a whole range of challenges. I would also put that into some perspective. The rate of growth underlying the assumptions for growing to a city of 6 million over the next 40 years is actually lower than the rate of growth that's happened over the last 40 years. So yes, there are challenges, but we also have, in a sense, experience in actually how we've managed a very significantly growing city over the last 40 years. The structure of the population is also changing, and others have mentioned this. The traditional family structures are diminishing, more single-person households, and how we actually accommodate those people in an environment which has high-quality amenity is obviously a key challenge for us. Similarly, the labour market is changing, and anyone who has lived in this city for an extended period of time will know how it's transformed in part by a whole range of push-pull factors, not least of which the decline of old-scale manufacturing and the transformation of this city into very much a service economy. And of course the challenges of climate change and changing technologies. I won't say anything particularly about climate change, but just, I guess, just to make an observation around the public debate over the last 3 or 4 years that we've experienced here, and perhaps even a little bit longer, and that is that to manage the major transformations that are going to have to occur in this city and this economy, and really the major opportunities as we move from a carbon-based economy to based very heavily on coal and oil to different forms of energy, is not something that's helped by calling it the greatest moral challenge of our time. It's not something that's helped, I guess, by creating an environment of crisis. In liberal democracies, people don't respond particularly well to crises unless, of course, they feel it themselves. And I think one of the real difficulties in developing public policy, and we can all see it particularly being played out in Australia in the last 3 or 4 years, is that there's a distinct mismatch between the sense of crisis that we get from people coming over like Al Gore and telling us about an inconvenient truth, and that being picked up as part of the political lexicon, and the development of appropriate and necessary reforms in public policy which need to be accommodated within, as I say, a liberal democracy. I think in China you can do it differently. We face a whole range of planning challenges in this city. I'd like to put some of that in the context, and Carol Coletta made a very important point earlier about the importance of cities. And I think that insight about the importance of cities is something that very much sits at the core of all our thinking, and needs to be at the core of all our thinking around city and urban development. Australia, and we often don't realise it ourselves, we are one of the most highly urbanised countries in the world. 80% of our population lives in cities of over 100,000, and about 60% of our population, if not more, lives in a small number of relatively large urban metropolises. So we are very much an urban society. If you think about Victoria, and spatial geography is very important, Victoria is essentially Melbourne and its immediate hinterland, the regional cities within 2 hours of Melbourne. That's essentially the Victorian economy. Making that network work well is the core challenge for all regional governments, and that's what state governments are. And that notion, and in a sense, that provides us with a whole lot of advantages that state governments in Victoria have taken advantage of over a period of time, that many of the larger states and more dispersed states with a larger population volume have struggled with. In many ways we're European in the way in which our urban geography operates. And successive governments now, probably for at least 3 decades, perhaps even longer, have really, sometimes more explicitly and sometimes less explicitly, have actually been thinking about how to create that network. If one thinks back into the 80s, focusing specifically on Melbourne, we saw the opening up of South Bank. Through the 90s, we saw the Docklands development. We saw a whole range of road networks linking the city. We saw some institutional restructuring in relation to local government reform, which has provided particularly the regional centres with a strong governance, which has been quite critical, I think, as a platform for their vibrancy. And then going through the last decade, we've seen the regional rail networks developed. We've seen IT linkages into those cities. We've seen a range of strategic plans, both regional blueprints and Melbourne at 5 million Victorian Transport Plan. All of them are about creating that important network, which is essentially about making Melbourne and its hinterland work.